All right. Hey there, fellow philosophy enthusiast. The one who's always pondering the big questions like what's it all about, meaning and reality and all that jazz. Well, today we're tackling a real head scratcher. It's something that's puzzled thinkers for centuries, and I bet it's crossed your mind too, especially if you're into how language shapes our world. We're diving deep into the meaning of religious language.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Religious language, it's a unique beast for sure, especially for a philosopher like yourself who's constantly wrestling with the very nature of meaning. We come across these statements, these utterances that seem to describe a reality that's often, well, beyond our senses. Like, how do we even begin to unpack what these words are truly saying?
Exactly. And to guide us through this labyrinth of ideas, we've got a fantastic resource. It's a religious language entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's super comprehensive, a real deep dive into the different philosophical approaches to this age-old question. Now, think of it like our trusty map for this exploration.
Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to dissect those different ways philosophers have tried to make sense of religious sentences and utterances. We'll be looking at the major debates, the points of contention, where things get a little heated, and ultimately, what do these different perspectives reveal about not just language itself, but also about belief, about the very nature of religious claims.
Sounds like a plan. So let's start simple. Like, what about taking religious language at face value? What you see is what you get.
Okay, so that's the face value theory. It says, all right, if you have a religious statement like God is omnipotent, it's pretty straightforward. It's got a proposition, God has all the power, and it's expressing a belief in that proposition. It's describing a state of affairs, just like in science or history.
Right, so it's treating religious language the same way we treat other kinds of language that aim to describe the world around us. The only difference here is that God is the subject matter, the thing being talked about.
Precisely. But here's the kicker. A lot of the theories we're going to explore, they actually push back against this whole face value thing. They're like, hold on, it's not that simple. That's where the real philosophical fireworks begin.
Oh, I love fireworks. Bring on the sparks. So some theories say, nope, religious utterances don't actually express propositions at all. Now, that's a bold move. Where do we even begin with that?
Well, one of the big names here is A.J. Ayer, the OG logical positivist. He's all about the empirical verification principle. Basically, for a statement to be meaningful, it's got to be empirically verifiable, meaning you can test it through observation. Or it's got to be analytically true by definition, like a tautology.
So like the sky is blue is verifiable because I can look up and see it. And all bachelors are unmarried is analytically true because the definition of a bachelor includes being unmarried.
Right on. But the really radical thing about Ayer's view is that he's basically saying, look, a whole bunch of stuff that philosophers have been talking about for centuries, like metaphysics and theology, it's all meaningless because, you guessed it, it's neither verifiable nor analytic.
And religious statements, they fall right into that category, don't they? Like you can't exactly observe God's love with your senses. And statements about God, they're not usually considered analytic truths. So Ayer's conclusion, and it's a famous one, is that religious language is literally meaningless.
Oh, that's got to sting for some folks.
Yeah, no kidding. It's a pretty provocative claim. And what's interesting is Ayer, he was fine with ethical statements. He said they express emotions or feelings like saying, yay for honesty or Buddha lying. That's his emotivism. But when it came to religious language, he didn't really offer a similar positive interpretation. He seemed to be saying, just chuck it out, it's nonsense.
But hold on, wasn't there a lot of pushback against verificationism itself? Like, isn't the principle itself kind of self-defeating? Oh yeah, the philosophers had a field day with that. The big problem is that the verification principle, it can't be verified itself. It's not something you can test empirically, and it's not an analytic truth either. So by its own standards, it would be meaningless. Talk about awkward.
Ouch. And didn't Ayer struggle to actually define the principle in a way that made sense? Like, if it's too strict, you end up throwing out legitimate scientific theories. And if it's too loose, then anything goes, and you're back to square one.
Absolutely. And when Ayer's trying to explain why religious statements don't pass the test, he says, okay, even if God exists, might imply some observable stuff in the world. Believers aren't just talking about those observable things. They're positing something more, like a supernatural being, which, you can't verify empirically.
But isn't there a bit of a contradiction there? Like, by using the verification principle to say what God exists means in terms of its observable consequences, isn't Ayer kind of implying that it is verifiable, at least in some sense? Because initially, the principle was supposed to be about whether something is meaningful at all, not just about what kind of meaning it has.
Oh, you got it. That's a key distinction. And even if we play along with Ayer's premise, religious statements would be in a similar boat as a lot of scientific hypotheses. We can't directly observe theoretical entities, but we infer their existence from their observable effects. And despite verificationism losing its grip as the ultimate arbiter of meaning, the whole issue of whether religious claims can be verified or falsified, it's still a big deal in the philosophy of religion.
So Ayer is saying, no propositions here, folks, move along.
Hmm.
But non-cognitivism, it's a bit more nuanced, right? It's not about chucking out meaning altogether, but saying that religious language expresses something other than, cold, hard facts.
You nailed it. Non-cognitivism says religious language is about expressing non-cognitive states, like feelings, intentions, or commitments. It's not about conveying objective truths that can be true or false. It's got a different function altogether.
Okay, let's unpack some of these non-cognitive approaches.
Yeah.
Our source talks about R.B. Braithwaite and his idea of religious plans. Sounds intriguing.
Right, so Braithwaite, he's building on Ayer's emotivism about ethics. He's saying religious statements are basically expressions of commitment to a certain way of life. Like when someone says, God is love, they're not making a factual claim about God. They're expressing their intention to live a life of love, like agape love.
It was more about action, about living a certain way, than about describing some abstract quality of God.
Exactly. And religious stories like the parables and creation myths, Braithwaite sees them as tools for living, psychological aids. He says they're entertained, not necessarily believed in a literal sense. They provide models for behavior.
But isn't there a bit of a problem there? Does a religious person really just entertain these narratives without actually believing in them on some level? And how does this theory explain all the different interpretations and arguments within a religion? If every statement boils down to live a good life, then wouldn't all those different claims mean the same thing?
You're hitting on some key criticisms. It does seem like Braithwaite's view oversimplifies things, doesn't quite capture the nuances and diversity within religious traditions.
It's a bit too one-size-fits-all, maybe. Now, what about George Berkeley's approach? Our source calls it mixed strategies. That sounds a bit more flexible.
Yeah, Berkeley, he's not as sweeping as Ayer or Braithwaite. He doesn't reject propositional content for all religious language. He's more picky. He's got his eye on certain Christian mysteries, like grace, original sin, the afterlife. Those, he says, we don't have clear ideas about. So they don't really express facts, but rather evoke certain feelings and encourage specific actions.
But for the rest of religious language, especially talk about God, Berkeley's still on board with the cognitive view, right? God refers to real stuff. And those statements are meaningful, even rationally justifiable.
You got it. So for Berkeley, talk about grace, it's not about conveying a clear fact. It's about prompting people to live a certain way. Same with the Trinity. Even if we don't fully grasp it, it's important because of its effect on how believers act. He's basically saying these mysteries, they're more about the will and feelings than the intellect. They're meant to guide people towards a holy life.
But how do you draw the line between what's cognitive and what's not in religious language? And how do these two types of claims interact? Like, what if you have a conditional statement that includes both? That seems tricky.
Yeah, that's the problem with mixed theories. Berkeley says we can tell the difference based on whether we have a clear idea about something. But that's subjective, isn't it? And the interaction problem, it's a big one. Like, take the statement, if God is just, then salvation is granted by grace. If God is just is cognitive, but salvation is granted by grace is non-cognitive, what does that even mean for the whole statement? And if the second part is just about expressing an attitude, doesn't its meaning change when it's part of a conditional? It also makes it tough to figure out if arguments that mix these two types of claims are valid or not.
So even though Berkeley's approach is more nuanced, it still runs into some serious roadblocks.
Yeah.
What about a full-blown non-cognitivist theory? Maybe taking some cues from expressivism and ethics. Could that work?
It's worth exploring. One argument for it is that faith, it's deeply tied to our motivations and feelings, right? Most people would agree that faith has a practical side. It shapes how we act. That's kind of like the argument ethical non-cognitivists use.
So the idea is that religious language is primarily about expressing those feelings and commitments of faith, not about describing some objective reality out there.
That's the gist of it. But religious non-cognitivism has its own challenges. There are general objections to non-cognitivism that apply here too, like the Frege-Deitch problem. It asks how non-cognitive expressions can fit into logical arguments. If God is good is just an attitude, how does that attitude combine with other propositions in a logical way? And then there's the problem of finding the specific attitudes that all religious utterances express. How is the attitude for God is all-knowing different from the attitude for God is omnipresent? It's hard to create a system that accounts for all the nuances of religious language.
So you'd need a whole map of different attitudes to match the variety of religious statements. All right, moving on. We've seen theories that say religious language doesn't even deal with propositions. Now let's look at different views on what the content of that language might be. Our source mentions paradoxical content.
Right, paradoxical content. This view says some religious claims are inherently paradoxical, contradictory, or maybe they're just too complex for us to fully understand, so they don't really express coherent propositions in the usual sense.
So it's not that they're meaningless like Ayer said, it's more like their meaning is inherently problematic, either contradicting itself or going beyond our cognitive abilities.
You got it. Like, think about the classic dilemmas with divine omnipotence. Can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it? Or the Trinity, one God in three persons. These are head-scratchers for sure.
So the issue isn't verifiability, but the very content of the statements themselves.
That's the idea. Some philosophers, like Ronald Hepburn, say this paradoxical language still has value. It can stimulate our imagination and shape our moral compass.
Right.
Stephen Mulhall, he suggests that some religious utterances might work like riddles. They keep us thinking, keep us engaged with their elusive meaning.
And this ties in with apophatic theology, doesn't it? The idea that God is ultimately beyond human comprehension and language.
Absolutely. Apophaticism says when we say God is good, we're not really capturing God's essence. We're acknowledging the limits of our human minds and language when facing the divine mystery.
So the act of talking about God, even if our words fall short, highlights those very limitations.
Precisely. But of course, someone who believes in taking religious language at face value would say, hey, this is all based on theological assumptions, not on how people actually use religious language. People do treat these statements as descriptions. They assert them, they argue with them, they believe them.
Right. You can't ignore how religious language functions in actual conversations and debates. Okay, another view on content is reductionism. This word gets thrown around a lot in philosophy. What does it mean specifically for religious language?
So linguistic reductionism about religion is like this. It wants to explain the truth of religious statements in terms of statements about something else, usually something natural. Like, instead of saying God created the world is about a supernatural being, a reductionist would say, no, it's really about natural processes.
Okay, so it's different from saying, for example, that pagan gods were just deified humans. That's about the origin of belief, not about the meaning of the language itself.
Exactly. Linguistic reductionism is all about finding a reduced set of sentences, usually within a naturalistic framework, that determine whether religious sentences are true or false. There's some history to this. Spinoza talked about interpreting God in terms of nature's order, and in the 20th century we had folks like Julian Huxley and religious naturalists suggesting that God might refer to natural forces or some kind of ultimate mystery.
And wasn't there Gordon Kaufman who said, we should think of God as the creative process we see in evolution and history?
Yeah, but the problem with reductionism is that it often starts with a pre-existing belief, like atheism or pantheism, and then tries to reinterpret religious language to fit that belief. It's not a neutral analysis of what people mean when they use those words. And some reductionists, like Kaufman, seem to be saying how we should think about God, not how people actually do.
So they're kind of imposing their own worldview on religious language. Okay, so paradoxical content and reductionism, they both struggle to account for how religious language is actually used. Let's shift gears now and look at theories that focus on the use of religious language. They say it's not always about making literal assertions, even if it has propositional content.
That's right. It's not just about what's being said, but what's being done with those words. This is where speech act theory comes in, the idea that saying something is also performing an action, like asserting, questioning, promising, and so on.
So maybe religious language isn't always about stating facts. Maybe it's doing something else entirely.
Exactly. And one possibility is that religious language uses terms analogously or metaphorically. This goes way back in theology to Aquinas and his doctrine of analogy.
Aquinas was all about analogy, wasn't he?
Big time. He said when we use words like good for both humans and God, the meaning isn't exactly the same, but it's not completely different either. It's analogous, there's a proportional similarity. And Richard Swinburne, he's got a modern take on analogy. He says it involves loosening up the rules of how a word works, either syntactically or semantically. So when we say God is a person, we're kind of tweaking the meaning of person compared to how we use it for humans.
But isn't that kind of tweaking something we do all the time in language? Like when I say this table is square, I don't mean it's perfectly geometrically square. So is religious analogy really that special?
That's a good point. Our source makes that argument. We often adjust word meanings based on the context. So maybe analogy in religious language is just a normal part of communication, especially when you're talking about something as, well, unique as God.
So it's still literal, just context sensitive.
Yeah.
But then there's the idea of irreducibly metaphorical religious language. This is where metaphors aren't just illustrations. They're the only way to express truths about God.
Right. Thinkers like Paul Tillich, Anthony Kenny, and Sally McFaig are big on this. They say you can't fully translate those metaphors into literal language without losing something essential.
And William Alston, he's got a name for this, the irreducibility theory, or IT. He says metaphors are the sole vehicle for talking about God, and you can't paraphrase them without sacrificing their truth.
But Alston's not buying it. He says metaphors, even religious ones, can usually be paraphrased literally, even if it loses some of the impact. And he points out a problem for IT. If a metaphor about God implies something true about God, then that implication should also be metaphorical, and that could go on forever, making communication really messy.
So theories of religious metaphor have to grapple with this irreducibility claim and explain how these metaphors actually convey knowledge. Okay, another way religious language might go beyond literal assertion is through praise and prayer. Our source brings up Jean-Luc Marion and Jacques Derrida on this.
Marion, he's influenced by apophatic theology. He says when we say things like God is good, we're not stating facts about God. We're engaging in praise, expressing devotion, awe. He sees God as this saturated phenomenon, something that overwhelms our human concepts.
Oh, God is good is more like an exclamation of wonder than a description.
Exactly. It's acknowledging that our words are inadequate. But Derrida, he pushes back. He says praise still involves predication, saying something about God. He thinks religious talk is better understood as prayer, a pure address to the other.
So for Derrida, prayer is more direct, less about describing God and more about, well, praying. But doesn't prayer often involve talking about God too, like our Father who art in heaven?
True, and our source points that out. Derrida's objection to praise seems a bit weak. Just because God is good looks grammatically similar to the table is round doesn't mean they're doing the same thing. Marion's point is that the intention and context are completely different. But both views raise questions about how aware speakers are of their language's limits when talking about God and how to deal with the descriptive elements that pop up in both praise and prayer.
It really makes you think about the assumptions we bring to religious language. All right, next up is fictionalism. This is the idea that we might treat religious claims like they're part of a story, a fictional narrative.
Right. Fictionalism in general says it's okay to engage with a discourse without believing it's literally true. And in religion, some fictionalists propose quasi-assertion. It's like playing along, saying the words without really committing to their truth.
So it's like when we enjoy a novel, we don't have to believe the characters are real to appreciate the story.
Exactly. Our source talks about two types of fictionalism, revolutionary and hermeneutic. Revolutionary fictionalism says we should treat religion as fiction even if we don't currently. It's a way to keep the good parts of religion, the ethics and social aspects, without needing actual belief.
So it's more of a proposal for how to approach religion.
Yeah, thinkers like Robin Lepoidevin and Peter Lipton fall into this category. And there's the Sea of Faith network, influenced by Don Cupid. They're also into this idea. But hermeneutic fictionalism is different. It says religious people already engage in this quasi-assertion. They affirm religious claims without truly believing them.
That's a bolder claim. It's like saying there's widespread self-deception among religious believers.
Right. Georges Ray, he calls this meta-atheism. He says religious folks in a scientific age, they might say they believe, but deep down they act like they don't. Our source also brings up the debate about whether faith requires belief. Some say faith is more about acceptance, trust, or commitment. This fits with hermeneutic fictionalism because it suggests you can have faith without strict belief.
So fictionalism, it's a radical way of looking at religious language. It shifts the focus from belief to other things like acceptance or even self-deception. Okay, last one under use is religious purposes. The idea here is that religious language has specific goals, but they're not about asserting truths.
Right. Instead of being a single speech act like assertion, religious language might have a variety of purposes. Wittgenstein, for instance, he said religious judgment is like a picture that guides our actions, and Kant thought religious talk provides a framework for thinking about morality.
Our source highlights Ian Ramsey and Rowan Williams. Ramsey said religious language aims to evoke a special kind of discernment, a realization of something profound that changes our whole perspective.
Ramsey believed this odd discernment leads to a total commitment to a certain way of life. He thought different religious expressions have different functions. Talk of eternal purpose reveals something about the cosmos, while saying God is impassible is more about how we should use the word God. For him, religious sentences have meaning, but are used for specific religious purposes.
And Rowan Williams said religious language challenges us, both morally and conceptually. It makes us rethink our understanding of the world and even our idea of God.
Williams thought this challenging function is even stronger when religious statements aren't logically consistent. But again, those who support a face value interpretation would say that if the main point of religious language is not to assert truths, then truth becomes less important. And they might say these theories are just proposals for what religious language should do, not what it actually does.
So we've covered a lot of ground, challenging that initial face value approach. Now let's dive into religious minimalism. It seems to agree that religious language has propositions and is used to make assertions, but it has a different view on truth and reality in a religious context.
Yeah, minimalism, often linked to the later Wittgenstein and his followers, says religious statements have content and are used to say things, but they're skeptical about applying a strong realist understanding of truth, reference, and all that to religion. They have a more modest view of what it means to be descriptive and say these realism-relevant concepts work differently depending on the language game or discourse you're in.
So instead of having one standard of truth for everything, minimalism says truth depends on the rules and practices of each specific area, whether it's science, history, or religion.
Precisely. Hilary Putnam, he used Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblances and said big concepts like language, reference, and truth, they don't have a fixed essential meaning. They're more like a bunch of overlapping similarities. So trying to force the standards of one area onto another just creates confusion. He also suggested that truth is about what's rationally acceptable within a specific discourse, considering the standards of that discourse.
And D.Z. Phillips, another Wittgensteinian, he also embraced this minimalism. He said, sure, we can say God refers to something, but reference and object and existence mean different things in religious talk compared to other areas.
You got it. Minimalists generally agree that religious statements have content, that those realism-related concepts are internal to each language game, and that the goal is to figure out the specific standards for each area. But there's some debate about truth. Some, like Phillips, say there are multiple concepts of truth, each with its own meaning. Others, like Putnam, are more pluralist, saying the core meaning of truth stays the same, but it gets specified differently in different contexts.
So minimalism is like a middle ground between taking everything at face value and saying religious language is not descriptive at all. It acknowledges that religious language makes claims, but understands those claims within the framework of religious practice. But our source points out some criticisms too. Some say minimalism is more of a general approach than a fully worked out theory, and there are objections to these pluralist or fragmented views of truth.
Those are valid points. Minimalism provides a framework, but not always a detailed theory of meaning. And the idea of different truths for different contexts, that's still controversial. But it does offer a way to avoid the classic debate between realism and non-cognitivism.
And of course, Wittgenstein is a key figure here, even though he didn't write a ton about religion directly. His work has been used to support many of these anti-face value theories.
Definitely. But the minimalist interpretation emphasizes Wittgenstein's point about the difference between religious sentences and scientific or historical sentences. He was big on the idea of different standards of warrant, the kinds of reasons and evidence that count in each area. He used examples to show how religious belief is different from scientific or everyday belief, highlighting the different types of reasons involved.
So, the minimalist Wittgenstein wasn't saying religion is just emotion or fiction. He was trying to describe its unique character, its own way of being true and relating to reality, which is different from the empirical sciences. But some critics worry that this leads to fideism, the idea that faith is totally separate from reason and other forms of knowledge.
Right. The concern is that it isolates religion. But minimalists say that having different standards of justification doesn't mean religion is completely cut off from other areas. Science and history can still influence religious belief, even if they're not the ultimate deciders of truth within a religious system.
Finally, our source briefly touches on reference and logic.
Hmm.
What are the key points for a philosopher of language here?
In terms of reference, there's the debate about whether God is more like a name, picking out a specific being, or more like a description tied to certain attributes. This relates to different theories of how names work in philosophy, like descriptivism versus causal theories. And these different views affect how we see the possibility of being wrong about God and how the name God came to be used in the first place.
And what about logic in religious language? Any special considerations there?
It's not as widely explored, but some connect the epiphatic idea of God's ineffability with paraconsistent logic, which allows for true contradictions. And Michael Dummett looked at whether divine omniscience logically implies bivalence, the idea that every statement is either true or false. That has implications for realism in religious discourse.
Wow, this has been quite a journey through the world of religious language. It's clear that the meaning of these seemingly straightforward utterances is anything but simple. We've seen a whole range of philosophical views trying to make sense of them.
Yeah, for someone like you, a philosopher who's always wrestling with meaning and reality, these debates are super relevant. They touch on the big questions. What is truth? What is belief? How do we understand claims that seem to go beyond our everyday experience?
So after all these different perspectives, what do you find most convincing? Is there one theory that nails it? Or do we need a more nuanced approach? It's a question worth pondering. And for those who want to dive deeper, I highly recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry and the works of the thinkers we've discussed. It's a fascinating and ever-evolving conversation.
Absolutely. It's a conversation that'll keep those philosophical gears turning.
And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive for today. Until next time, keep those minds sharp and those questions coming.
Keep questioning, keep exploring. That's what philosophy is all about.